You know how sometimes you think you know exactly what you want until life shows you something completely different? That's basically what happened to me in Italy. And honestly, I'm still processing how everything went sideways so fast. I'm Sydney. I'm 27, and I thought I had my relationship with Donald figured out. Donald works in some kind of technical field. Honestly, I never really paid attention to the specifics, but he makes good money, way more than my retail job. The thing about Donald is he's always been the type to just handle everything. Bills, dinner plans, groceries, literally every detail of our lives. And look, I'm not going to pretend I didn't appreciate it. Why would I complain when someone wants to take care of everything? That's what I always told Chloe when she'd give me those judgmental looks like I was using him. Please. Donald offered to handle things. I didn't force his hand. The Italy trip came up during one of our usual weeknight routines, when we were eating takeout and watching some cooking show. Donald just casually dropped that he's been saving up for something special. 2 weeks in Italy, he said, all expenses covered. Just us exploring Rome and Florence. Honestly, my first reaction wasn't romantic butterflies. It was relief that we'd finally be doing something interesting instead of our usual weekend routine. Here's the thing about Donald, though. He plans absolutely everything down to the last detail. The flights, hotels, restaurant reservations, even which attractions we'd see on which specific days. It's thoughtful, I guess, but sometimes I felt more like I was following someone else's vacation checklist than actually experiencing anything spontaneous. He'd already researched the best gelato spots, mapped out efficient walking routes, and bought this thick guidebook that he'd constantly reference. The weeks leading up to departure, Donald was practically bouncing off the walls with excitement, showing me photos of the Colosseum and asking if I wanted to book a cooking class. I played along because, honestly, a free trip to Italy. Who's going to say no to that? But something felt weird about the whole thing, like he was trying way too hard to manufacture some perfect romantic movie moment. You know that feeling when someone's pushing so desperately for something to be magical that it almost guarantees it won't be. That's exactly what this whole trip planning felt like. Still, I wasn't stupid. I packed my cutest outfits and spent hours creating Pinterest boards of all the photos I wanted to recreate. Chloe helped me pick out dresses, and we had this whole afternoon getting travel-sized makeup. She kept making jokes about how this might be the trip where Donald finally proposes. And honestly, that thought made my stomach feel strange. Not excited strange, more like trapped strange. 2 years with Donald felt comfortable enough, I suppose. He was reliable, predictable, and always available when I needed something handled. But lately, everything between us felt automatic, like we were just going through the same motions week after week. Maybe Italy would change things up, I thought. Maybe experiencing new places together would remind me why we made sense as a couple. Or maybe it would just be 2 weeks of Donald micromanaging every moment while I smiled and went along with his plans. Either way, at least I'd come back with some incredible photos. The night before our flight, Donald couldn't settle down. He kept checking his phone for airline updates and triple-checking that our passports were in the correct pocket of his carry-on. I pretended to sleep while he tossed around next to me, but really, I was lying there wondering what I was actually hoping to discover in Italy. Adventure, romance, something to make me feel genuinely alive again instead of just comfortable. The flight over was typical Donald. Organized boarding passes, knew exactly which terminal and gate, and even packed snacks. I spent most of the flight scrolling through social media and napping while he read through his guidebook and made notes. When we finally landed in Rome, I felt this rush of excitement that had nothing to do with Donald and everything to do with being somewhere completely new. Our hotel was nice. Donald had obviously spent time researching something romantic with a view of old buildings and narrow streets. That first evening, we walked around the area, and I have to admit, Rome was absolutely stunning. The architecture, the energy, the way everything felt so alive and different from home. Donald was in full tour guide mode. reading facts from his phone about every building and fountain we passed. It was sweet, I guess, but I found myself wishing we could just experience things without constantly learning the historical significance of every stone. That night at dinner, Donald was so proud of himself for finding this authentic little restaurant. The food was amazing, and for a moment, I thought maybe this trip would actually be the reset we needed. But then I caught myself watching other couples at nearby tables, and they all seemed so effortlessly connected, laughing and talking without needing to fill every silence with guidebook facts. Something about seeing that natural chemistry made me realize how forced everything felt between Donald and me, even in this beautiful setting. The next few days followed Donald's carefully planned itinerary. Vatican museums, Colosseum, Trevi Fountain, all the major highlights. Everything was gorgeous, and I got great photos, but I kept feeling like I was experiencing Rome through Donald's predetermined lens instead of discovering it myself. He'd wake up early to check the weather and plan our walking route, while I just followed along, taking pictures and nodding when he'd share random historical facts. It wasn't terrible, but it wasn't exciting either. It was just more of the same comfortable routine we had at home, except with better scenery. I started wondering if this was what the rest of my life would look like. Donald making all the decisions while I just went along for the ride. Then we got to Florence, and that's when everything changed. Donald had booked us into this charming hotel near the city centre, and he was already mapping out our museum visits for the next few days. But that first afternoon, while Donald was taking a nap because he wasn't feeling well, I decided to explore on my own for a couple of hours. I just wanted to wander without an agenda, maybe find a quiet cafe, and people watch without having to discuss the architectural significance of every building. The afternoon sun was perfect, and Florence felt different from Rome, more intimate, more romantic, in a way that actually felt genuine instead of forced. I found this little wine bar tucked away on a side street, the kind of place Donald never would have chosen because it wasn't in any of his guidebooks. That's where I met Luca. He was sitting at the bar, and when I walked in, he looked up and smiled in this way that made my stomach flip. Not the polite, comfortable feeling I got with Donald, but something electric and immediate. Luca was everything Donald wasn't. Spontaneous, charming, with an energy that made me feel more alive in 5 minutes than I had in months. We started talking, and the conversation flowed so naturally that I completely lost track of time. He told me about growing up in Florence, about his work, about all these hidden spots in the city that tourists never find. But more than that, he listened to me in a way that made me feel interesting and dynamic instead of just going along with someone else's plans. When I finally checked my phone, I realized I'd been gone for 3 hours. Donald had texted twice, asking where I was and when I'd be back for dinner. The contrast between Luca's easy attention and Donald's nervous check-ins hit me hard. Here was someone who made me feel fascinating and spontaneous, while back at the hotel was someone who needed to know my exact location and return time. I told Luca I had to get back to my boyfriend, and the disappointment in his eyes made my chest tighten. He asked if I'd meet him again the next day, and even though I knew I shouldn't, I heard myself saying yes. Walking back to the hotel, I felt like I was in a complete daze, already counting the hours until I could see him again. Donald was waiting when I got back, obviously relieved but trying not to seem clingy. He'd already picked out a restaurant for dinner and had our evening planned, and suddenly all his thoughtful preparation felt suffocating instead of sweet. How could I sit through dinner, making small talk about tomorrow's museum visits, when my mind was completely consumed with thoughts of Luca? That night, lying next to Donald while he slept peacefully, I stared at the ceiling and admitted something I'd been avoiding for months. I wasn't happy. Not really. I was comfortable and taken care of, but I wasn't genuinely happy or excited about anything in my life with Donald. Meeting Luca had shown me what I was missing. The next day, Donald wanted to visit the Uffizi Gallery, but I convinced him I was getting a headache and needed to rest. He was immediately concerned, offering to skip the museum and take care of me, which only made me feel worse about lying. But I couldn't help myself. I needed to see Luca again. I met Luca at a different cafe, and this time we talked for hours about everything: travel, dreams, what made us feel alive. He had this way of asking questions that made me really think about what I wanted from life, not just what was expected or safe. When he asked about my relationship with Donald, I found myself being honest about feeling trapped in a comfortable routine instead of living an actual life. Luca didn't try to convince me to leave Donald or do anything manipulative like that. He just listened and made me feel understood in a way I hadn't experienced in so long. When he leaned over and kissed me, it felt like waking up from a long, boring dream. Everything about it was electric and right and completely different from the predictable affection I shared with Donald. I knew I was crossing a line, but in that moment, I didn't care. For the first time in years, I felt genuinely excited about something, genuinely attracted to someone who saw me as more than just a comfortable companion. We spent the afternoon walking through parts of Florence I never would have seen with Donald, talking and laughing and connecting in a way that felt effortless and real. The last few days of our trip became this weird double life where I'd spend mornings and evenings with Donald, following his itinerary and pretending everything was normal, then sneak away in the afternoons to meet Luca. Each time we were together, the connection got stronger, and returning to Donald felt more and more like putting on a costume that didn't fit anymore. Luca never pushed me to make any decisions, but he did ask what I was planning to do when I got back home. The question terrified me because I genuinely didn't know. I couldn't imagine going back to my old routine with Donald, but I also couldn't imagine blowing up my entire life for someone I'd known for less than a week. On our last scheduled day in Italy, Donald had planned this romantic final evening. Dinner at an expensive restaurant, a sunset walk, the works. But all I could think about was that in 24 hours, I'd be on a plane back home, probably never seeing Luca again. The thought made me feel panicked in a way I couldn't control. That's when I made the decision that would change everything. Instead of going along with Donald's plan, instead of pretending everything was fine, I decided I needed more time to figure out what I actually wanted. Not what was safe or expected, but what would actually make me happy. I told Donald I wanted to extend the trip, to stay in Italy longer to think about things. I didn't mention Luca specifically, but I made it clear that I needed space to figure out our relationship without him there, hovering and planning and trying to fix everything. The look on his face when I said it was devastating. He kept asking what he'd done wrong, what had changed, why I was suddenly unhappy when everything had seemed fine. But that was exactly the problem. Everything with Donald was always just fine, never amazing or exciting or surprising, just comfortable and predictable and safe. When Donald realized I was serious about staying, when he understood that I wasn't just having a moment but actually choosing to remain in Italy without him, something shifted in his expression. For the first time in 2 years, he looked at me like he didn't recognize me. I expected him to fight for us, to refuse to leave without me, to do something dramatic. Instead, he just went quiet and started looking at flight change options on his phone. The next morning, he told me he decided not to pay for my extended stay or my return ticket whenever I decided to come back. He said if I wanted to be independent and think about things alone, I should be financially independent too. Honestly, I was shocked. This was not the Donald I knew. The Donald who always took care of everything, who never made waves, who bent over backward to keep me happy. This Donald was cold and matter-of-fact in a way that actually scared me a little. But I was too caught up in my fantasy with Luca to really process what was happening. The next morning, he left for the airport alone. I watched him go with this strange mixture of relief and terror, knowing I'd just destroyed the most stable relationship I'd ever had for something that might turn out to be nothing more than a vacation fantasy. But as scared as I was, I also felt more alive than I had in months. After Donald left, I moved out of our nice hotel into a much cheaper place so I could afford to stay longer. Luca and I spent every day together for about a week, and it was everything I'd imagined. Romantic dinners, long walks, incredible chemistry, all of it. But then reality started creeping in, and I began to realize that a vacation romance and an actual relationship were two completely different things. Luca was charming and exciting, but he was also 24 and basically worked in hospitality, which meant he knew exactly what foreign women wanted to hear. When I started talking about maybe extending my stay even longer, maybe figuring out how to move to Italy permanently, he got this uncomfortable look and started mentioning other guests he was showing around the city. The fantasy shattered pretty quickly after that. Here I was, alone in a foreign country, burning through my savings and credit cards for a guy who turned out to be exactly what Donald would have warned me about if I'd been honest with him from the beginning. By the time I realized how stupid I'd been, I was almost out of money and too embarrassed to call Donald for help. I had to use my emergency credit card to buy a flight home. And when I landed, there was no one waiting for me at the airport. Donald had blocked my number, blocked me on social media, and according to Chloe, he'd already started moving his stuff out of our apartment. Apparently, he'd told everyone exactly what happened, how I'd met someone in Italy and decided to stay for him instead of coming home. The worst part was that people weren't even sympathetic. Chloe was furious with me for throwing away a good relationship for some random Italian guy. Donald's friends, who had always been nice to me, were openly hostile when I ran into them around town. Even my own parents were disappointed, asking how I could be so careless with someone who had treated me so well. Within a month, Donald had moved out completely and started dating someone new, a nurse named Rachel, who seemed to appreciate all the things about him that I'd found boring. She looked genuinely happy in the photos Chloe accidentally showed me, and Donald looked more relaxed and confident than I'd seen him in months. Watching him move on so easily while I was dealing with the aftermath of my impulsive decision felt like a slap in the face. I kept expecting him to reach out, to want to talk things through, or at least get closure. But he'd completely written me off, like our 2 years together meant nothing compared to my week of betrayal in Italy. The really twisted part was that I started getting angry at him for giving up on us so easily. How could he just replace me and move on like I was disposable? Where was the fight for our relationship, the effort to win me back? It felt like he'd been looking for an excuse to upgrade to someone better, and I'd handed him the perfect opportunity. I tried reaching out through mutual friends, thinking maybe we could work things out now that I'd gotten the Italy thing out of my system. But Donald made it clear through Brian that he wanted nothing to do with me, that what I'd done was unforgivable, and he was happier without me. 8 months after Italy, I'm still living with my parents, working the same retail job, and watching Donald build a life with Rachel that looked suspiciously like the life he'd tried to build with me. They went on trips together, but somehow when she posted photos, they looked natural and happy instead of forced like ours always had. The worst part was realizing that the problem hadn't been Donald at all. It had been me. I'd been so focused on what was missing from our relationship that I'd never appreciated what was actually there. His planning wasn't controlling. It was thoughtful. His predictability wasn't boring. It was stability. His willingness to pay for things wasn't him being a pushover. It was him showing love the way he knew how. They got engaged last month. A simple, elegant ring that she posted with a caption about finding her person. The comments were full of people congratulating them and saying how perfect they were together. I wanted to be bitter about it, wanted to convince myself that Rachel was just settling for the same boring guy I'd outgrown. But honestly, looking at their photos, they looked genuinely happy together, in a way Donald and I never had. The hardest pill to swallow was admitting that I'd been the problem all along. I'd spent 2 years with a good man who loved me and wanted to build a life together, and I'd thrown it all away because I was too immature and selfish to appreciate what I had. Now he was giving all of that love and stability to someone who deserved it, while I was starting over at 28 with nothing to show for my grand romantic adventure, except debt and regret. The really twisted part is that I'm not even sorry about Italy anymore. I'm sorry I got caught. I'm sorry Donald found out and left me. But I'm not actually sorry about choosing excitement over stability, which probably says everything about who I am as a person and why I'm sitting alone in my childhood bedroom instead of planning a wedding like I should be. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd just kept the Italy thing to myself, if I'd come home and pretended everything was normal while keeping Luca as a beautiful secret. But then I remember how suffocated I felt with Donald, and I know I would have sabotaged things eventually anyway. The truth is, I wanted to have my cake and eat it too. The security of Donald and the excitement of Luca. When I couldn't have both, I chose the excitement and lost everything. Now I have neither. And I'm learning that starting over at almost 30 is a lot harder than I thought it would be. Maybe someday I'll meet someone who can give me both stability and excitement. But honestly, I'm not holding my breath. Good guys like Donald don't come around that often, and when they do, they're smart enough not to waste their time on someone like me twice. I had my shot at happiness, and I chose chaos instead. That's the real story of my Italian adventure. Not a romantic comedy where the girl follows her heart and lives happily ever after, but a cautionary tale about what happens when you take a good thing for granted until it's too late to get it back.